My dear Sally, I was this evening favored with yours of the 14th. It is now between 8 and 9 o'clock, and I am just returned from court. I expect, my dear Sally, to see you sooner than we expected. There is a serious determination to send me to England, if possible, to avert a war.
This is a letter written by John Jay in 1794 to his wife. In 1793, the neutrality crisis and Genet affair led the United States to the brink of war. The United States passed the Neutrality Act in 1794 in an attempt to avoid the hostilities in Europe. But, despite their efforts, Britain continued to antagonize American ships. What could the United States do? The British operated the largest navy in the world. Washington knew they held all the cards. His goal was to keep the United States out of the war. But if he didn't stand up to Britain, the American economy would collapse.
Nothing can be more distant from every wish on my own account. I feel the impulse of duty strongly. If the nomination should take place, it will be in the course of a few days, and then it will appear in the papers. In the meantime, say nothing on the subject.
Jay was right about one thing. The news of his appointment would soon hit the papers, and within months, John Jay would become the most hated man in America. Leading the charge was a man named Benjamin Franklin Bache. Bache was one of Washington's most vocal critics, and he was quick to use the controversy surrounding Jay to accuse Washington of treason, tyranny, even murder. Freedom of speech is a hallowed right in the history of the United States. But how was a president supposed to respond to such vicious attacks against his very character? Was a president meant to justify his unpopular decisions to the public? And how could he protect those that he appointed?
My dear, dear Sally, if it should please God to make me instrumental to the continuance of peace, we shall both have reason to rejoice.
This is Inventing the Presidency, Episode 6, The Price of Peace. By 1795, the reign of terror in France was winding down, but the war between Britain and France raged on. Still committed to the mission of neutrality, Washington wished to stay the course to avoid war with either Britain or France. On paper, this seemed easy. Americans would continue to trade with both nations and would avoid provoking either one. But none of this seemed to matter to Great Britain. In fact, to some Americans, it seemed as though Great Britain was still holding a grudge from the Revolution. For one, they were seizing American ships bound for France. And while Britain flooded American markets with cheap goods from across the British Empire, they refused to allow American merchant ships into British ports without subjecting them to heavy regulations and tariffs. Great Britain claimed that American ships carried foodstuffs that would feed their enemies. Thus, the cargo could be taken as contraband. More controversially, they claimed that American sailors who had once been British citizens were still subjects of the Crown and thus could be forcibly recruited into the British Navy. Impressment, as this practice was called, was a persistent threat to American vessels, and it would eventually become one of the grievances that led to the War of 1812. Many of these practices were a direct violation of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which had ended the Revolution. But what could the United States do? Washington knew that the United States was not ready to face Great Britain as an enemy again. The British had the largest and most powerful navy in the world. Washington did not want to end trade with France entirely, nor did he want to provoke Great Britain any further. A few years later, when reflecting back upon the neutrality crisis, he would write,
"Every true friend to this country must see and feel that the policy of it is not to embroil ourselves with any nation whatsoever, but to avoid their disputes and their politics. And if they will harass one another, to avail ourselves of the neutral conduct we have adopted. 20 years' peace, with such an increase of population and resources as we have right to expect, will in all probability enable us, in a just cause, to bid defiance to any power on earth. Why then should we prematurely embark in hostilities, the issue of which is never certain, always expensive, and beneficial to a few only?"
Washington was not opposed to a just war, but he wanted to avoid an expensive conflict between other powers, especially when he knew that the U.S. military and economy would not be able to survive it. Neutrality, he remained certain, was the best policy. Washington needed to smooth things over with Britain. Lingering grievances from the Revolution on both sides prevented the nations from moving forward peacefully. Washington originally wanted Alexander Hamilton to represent the United States, but Hamilton stepped back, suggesting that Washington instead go with his second choice, John Jay. Jay was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a Federalist supporter. He was also a close political ally of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. But that meant that those on the other side of the aisle, that is, those allied with Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans, were up in arms. When Washington chose Jay as his envoy, the reaction was swift and sharp.
It appears to be an object with the executive to prop a tottering minority. A minority whose views are at best but questionable, who would from appearances rather submit to a monarch or dissolve the Union than the present majority should dictate the measures of our government. Can any good reason be assigned why Jay was nominated as an envoy? Unless for the purpose of defeating the intention of the majority of the legislature.
This is an excerpt from the Aurora General Advertiser, a Philadelphia newspaper run by Benjamin Franklin Bache, sometimes called Lightning Rod Jr. Bache had earned himself a reputation as a Spitfire printer with a grudge to bear. He began his newspaper, the Philadelphia General Advertiser, in 1791, later renaming it the Aurora. Bache was not just any printer, however. In fact, he had a rather famous family connection. Here is Joseph Edelman, professor of history at Framingham State University.
So Benjamin Franklin Bache has an unusual path into the printing trade. He was born in 1769. His mother was Sally Franklin Bache, so Benjamin Franklin's daughter. And during the Revolutionary War, Franklin, when he goes to France, takes two of his grandsons, the other one being William Temple Franklin, but takes Temple Franklin and Benny Bache with him to Paris when he's negotiating and representing United States interests at the court of Versailles. So Bache actually learns how to print on Franklin's press at Passy. Franklin, when he's in France, sets up in a village just outside Paris, has a printing press constructed that he uses for a variety of purposes, one of which is to train his grandson how to print. So he learns directly from Franklin. They come back in 1785, Franklin to great acclaim as an elder statesman. Bache then goes to the college that is today the University of Pennsylvania and earns a degree. So he's college educated, which is very unusual for a newspaper printer and editor in this time period. So he starts the Aurora in 1790 as an ordinary run-of-the-mill newspaper. He is set up in business by his grandfather. Franklin dies in 1790, so he's in part a bequest to his grandson to have the materials to print those types, and the press and the shop are all given to Benny Bache. And he starts with a normal, ordinary, undistinguished newspaper, except that he carries a very famous name in Philadelphia, for a couple of years. And then it's really the French Revolution that pushes him as a supporter of France and the Republican ideals of France into opposition to the Washington administration, which takes a much more neutral line. He is very strongly pro-French at a time when the administration is declaring neutrality in the wars between Britain and France and is trying to avoid appearing partisan on either side of what's going on between those two European nations.
While there were still no formal political parties at this time, strong partisan divisions were beginning to crystallize around the controversial appointment of John Jay. Bache's main rival was the Gazette of the United States, run by a man named John Fenno. The Gazette was a Federalist paper and often defended Washington's decisions. How hot did this rivalry run? Well, in 1797, Fenno and Bache reportedly got into a fistfight on the streets of Philadelphia. Bache is even said to have caned Fenno over the head. Bache is a divisive figure historically, even today. Some saw his zealous attacks in the press as a sincere expression of his Republican beliefs. Others believe he had more personal motivations, that perhaps he was bitter about Washington spurning his father for a valuable federal appointment. Regardless, Bache seemed to believe strongly that the press was a vehicle through which the people could hold their elected officials to task. His methods for doing so, however, could be a little extreme at times. From 1790 to 1797, Bache would publish some of the most vicious and outlandish attacks on Washington and his administration. He published conspiracies that Washington was embezzling money from the Treasury.
As it is so easy a thing for the president to put his hand into the public treasury, it is a little extraordinary that a union of the purses of citizens should be called for to prosecute certain printers among us.
And he lashed out against Washington's levees and drawing rooms.
The editor of the Gazette of the United States has announced in his paper that the president's levee of Tuesday last was numerously attended. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. It was certainly necessary to let the public know that the just resentment of an injured and deeply insulted people had not yet reached the purview of St. Washington's, and manifested itself by so cruel an expression of utter contempt for the mock pageantry of monarchy as absence from a president's levee.
Nothing was off limits for Bache. He even accused Washington of murdering the French officer Jumonville in 1754, an accusation that is still debated today.
The accusation in question is no less than of having, while commanding a party of American troops, fired on a flag of truce, killed the officer in the act of reading the summons under the sanction of such a flag, and of having signed a capitulation in which the killing of that officer and his men was acknowledged as an act of assassination.
When Bache failed to find evidence to support his outlandish claims, he was comfortable with creating his own. He even tried to sell forged letters supposedly written by Washington. These fake letters declared Washington's love and support for the British monarchy.
Ambition and military arrogance are strong features in the private letters in question. The desire of an unlimited control over the army and of being the Magnus Apollo of his country show themselves, for his devotion to the monarch of Great Britain is now known to almost every citizen in the United States.
Here's one supposed quote from the letters alleged to have been written by Washington himself.
I love my king. You know I do. A soldier, a good man, cannot but love him.
Few seem to have taken these letters seriously. But the continued attacks on Washington's administration and character did begin to bother Washington. Writing to his dear friend and former secretary, David Humphreys, in 1796, Washington remarked,
"The gazettes will give you a pretty good idea of the state of politics and parties in this country, and will show you at the same time, if Beish's Aurora is among them, in what manner I am attacked for persevering steadily in measures which to me appear necessary to preserve us in a state of tranquility. But these attacks, unjust and as unpleasant as they are, will occasion no change in my conduct, nor will they produce any other effect in my mind than to increase the solicitude which long since has taken fast hold of my breast, to enjoy in the shades of retirement. Malignity, therefore, may dart its shafts, but no earthly power can deprive me of the consolation of knowing that I have not, in the whole course of my administration, committed an intentional error."
Washington chose not to engage directly with the press. In some respects, this too earned him censure. After all, was he so distant from the people as not to respond directly to their complaints? In other ways, it spared him the worst of the criticism. When Beish realized that Washington would not respond directly, he began taking his disagreements directly to Washington. Here is Lindsay Chervinsky, presidential historian and author of The Cabinet.
There were a series of opposition newspapers in Philadelphia, and Washington loved newspapers. He subscribed to tons of them, and anytime there was a new one, he pretty much subscribed to it. But when they became too critical, then he would cancel his subscription. And the Aurora was an example of a particularly critical newspaper in Philadelphia. After Washington canceled his subscription, the editors continued to deliver 3 copies of the Aurora every day to the president's house just to make him mad. And boy, did it work. He complained about this newspaper. He complained about this trick in the cabinet. He said they were just doing it to be impudent and to get under his skin, and it worked quite effectively.
Beish became creative with his mockery. In 1795, he sent Washington an invitation to
celebrate the late victories of the French Republic.
Washington wrote on the bottom of the letter,
"Intended as an insult, it is presumed."
Here is Joseph Edelman again.
One of the key factors for why newspapers are critical of Washington is that the question of what the job of the press is actually up for debate in the 1790s. And Washington, who disdains the idea of parties and so never claims for himself the label of a party, but his side tends to be the Federalists. The Federalists tend to see the press as a less legitimate or having a smaller and quieter role in a republic than do the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. So there develops this imbalance where papers that otherwise support the Federalists tend to have this view that it's uncouth to get into the weeds of political debates. So the first and really important thing to understand about these political leanings, ideologies in the 1790s is that they're very fluid and not yet well-defined. And they, as participants, are beginning to turn into something like political parties, but they're not like anything that we would recognize today. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about this, we're talking about tendencies and leaning one way or the other. The Jeffersonians, as their name suggests, tend to ally with Thomas Jefferson, who in the Washington administration is the first Secretary of State, who begins in the 1790s to develop an opposition to a set of Washington administration policies from inside the administration, yes, largely centering around Hamilton's economic plans and opposition to those ideas about how to run the economy and how to run the United States government.
These tensions did not settle as Jay was sent to Britain. Jay carried with him instructions guided by Hamilton and a cohort of Federalist senators. Remember that the Constitution gives the president the power to enter treaties with foreign nations, so long as he had the advice and consent of the Senate. But in the 1790s, there were still debates about what that meant. After all, in 1790, Washington had visited the Senate for their advice and consent regarding instructions for envoys sent to Native American nations, and that had proven disastrous. Recall what Lindsay Chervinsky told us in Episode 3.
Washington stood up and he yelled, "This defeats every purpose of my being here," except louder and bigger and scarier, because this was like the most famous man in the world. And here he was screaming at you in person. And he apparently was extraordinarily intimidating when he was mad.
Getting the Senate to approve Jay as the envoy had proved difficult enough. Many senators opposed to Jay's selection were feeding intel directly to Bache and other critics. To ask the Senate to weigh in on the specific instructions given to Jay would mean more prolonged debates and possibly a delay that could worsen tensions with Britain. So Hamilton, along with Senators King, Cabot, and Ellsworth, decided that Washington did not need to return to the Senate. The Senate had approved the envoy after much debate, and they would be required to approve any treaty that would eventually result from the mission. What did it matter if they did not consent to the specific instructions given to Jay? This decision, as small as it might seem, was an important precedent for the presidency. It empowered the president to make decisions regarding foreign envoys and streamline the process by which foreign diplomats could be sent. But it would prove wildly unpopular. For one, many believed that allowing a member of the Supreme Court to be appointed to an executive post was a conflict of interest.
That to permit judges of the Supreme Court to hold at the same time other offices emanating from the executive is destructive of their independence, and tending to expose them to the influence of the executive is mischievous and impolitic.
Others accused Washington of using executive appointments to subvert the will of the legislature.
It has now become a question whether Congress is necessary or of any utility to this country. To take a view of the executive conduct, it would seem as if the president considered a legislative body a dead weight upon the government and was resolved to obstruct its operations by diplomatic appointments.
Hamilton's instructions to Jay gave him several goals for the treaty. 1. The British would surrender their forts in the Northwest. At this time, the Northwest War that incited Sinclair's defeat was still raging, and the British had been supplying the Native Americans with weapons. At the same time, the United States wanted concessions at sea. Great Britain was to stop impressing American sailors, and they demanded that Britain reopen its ports in the West Indies to American trade. Other issues included redefining the border with Canada and compensating Southern enslavers for the enslaved people who had joined the British side during the war. But Washington and Hamilton likely knew that Jay would not be able to negotiate all of these demands. Great Britain was a more powerful nation with a stronger military and colonies across the world. The United States had no leverage to convince them to agree to these terms. The United States could not threaten a military response. They knew that they might not survive another war with Britain. And trade sanctions would likely hurt the United States more than it would hurt Great Britain. Sure, some of the British actions could be conceived as a violation of the Treaty of 1783, but who would stop them? For 4 months, Washington heard almost nothing about the treaty. Letters from Jay in England informed Washington that negotiations were underway. But then in November, Jay wrote Washington,
My dear sir, my task is done. This letter goes by the packet and the treaty with it. Some parts of it require elucidation to common readers. I have not the time for comments. Lord Grindal is anxious to dismiss the packet. I therefore write in haste. If this treaty fails, I despair of another.
Jay had managed to secure some victories for the United States. The British agreed to give up their ports if Americans promised to settle debts left unresolved after the Revolution. The British would give the United States most favored nation status when trading. However, Jay had to yield some mighty concessions to the British. For one, the British would allow American merchant ships into the West Indies, but only if they weighed less than 70 tons. For another, the British refused to provide compensation for slavery, a result that caused protests in the American South. And lastly, Jay could not prevent Great Britain from continuing to impress American sailors. It took months for the treaty to arrive in the United States. At first, the contents of the treaty were kept confidential until the Senate had a chance to debate and approve it. While divisions had begun to emerge during the Genet Affair and Whiskey Rebellion, some historians point to the Jay Treaty as the event that first solidified these partisan lines in the legislature. The Federalists were for the treaty, the Democratic Republicans against it. After considerable debate, the Senate ratified the treaty on June 24, 1795. It was a tight battle, passing 20-10. The ratification only passed on the condition that the trade restrictions in the West Indies be revoked. At this point, no one outside the Senate had seen the treaty. The public was aware that a treaty was being discussed, but it was treated as a classified document. But that wouldn't stop Benny Bache. On June 29, 1795, Bache published an unauthorized abridgment of the Jay Treaty for all to see. A concerned citizen, who was quickly revealed to be Senator Stevens Thompson Mason of Virginia, had leaked the document to Bache. Bache was said to have carried the papers himself all the way to Boston to distribute it as widely as he could among Americans. By July 1st, the Aurora was advertising that copies of the treaty could be bought from their offices and all major booksellers in Philadelphia. The speed by which Bache distributed the news was extraordinary, especially considering the time it typically took for news to spread. Here is Joseph Edelman again.
What they would do is you would have one sheet of paper folded in half to make a 4-page newspaper. And then for each of those pages, you would have to set type, sometimes 10,000 characters. This is an era when you had to pull each letter out of a drawer and set it individually upside down and backwards, because it gets reversed when you imprint it on the paper, into a straight line and then set into the columns and eventually into the whole page. And so that process can take a very long time. There's a time lag in terms of the time it takes to get the news from one place to another, but the latest news, so that might be for a Philadelphia newspaper, just a few days old for New York. It might be a week and a half, 2 weeks old for Williamsburg. It might be 2 weeks for Charleston, South Carolina, right? It depends on the most recent news. The freshest advices, as they say, might have a different time lag based on where it's coming from.
The outcry against the treaty was equally swift. Many Americans saw the treaty as giving Great Britain too many concessions. Some believed that it was an act of betrayal against the United States' French allies. Washington felt the sting of criticism keenly. Just a few weeks after the treaty was published, he wrote to Alexander Hamilton,
At present, the cry against the treaty is like that against a mad dog, and everyone, in a manner, seems engaged in running it down.
Washington believed that the controversy was largely due to bad faith interpretations. He believed that the initial fervor would die down. Then people would understand how beneficial it would be for the United States.
It has received the most tortured interpretation, and the writings against it are pregnant of the most abominable misrepresentations. Yet there are to be found, so far as my information extends, many well-disposed men who conceive that in the settlement of old disputes, a proper regard to reciprocal justice does not appear in the treaty.
The point of the treaty, according to Washington, was not to settle old grudges or to punish Great Britain, but to establish a peaceful relationship moving forward. The only way to find that peace, according to Washington, was through a stringent policy of neutrality. Washington did have his supporters. While Bache was publishing critiques of the Jay Treaty, Fenno was singing its praises.
It is not to be expected that the treaty with England would escape censure. The spirit of party has too long infected our public affairs not to show itself on this occasion. To those who are animated by a pure and exclusive love of our country, truth will be acceptable.
While the Senate's vote ratified the treaty, the House needed to approve the funds to enact it. Some in the House hoped to quash funding in the hopes of killing the treaty altogether. At one point, the vote was a tie, 49 votes for and 49 votes against. The Speaker of the House at that time was a man named Frederick Muhlenberg. He was known to have Democratic-Republican sympathies, so he was expected to vote against the treaty. Yet his tie-breaking vote for the treaty sealed the deal. Protests immediately broke out across the country. Bache and other critics of Washington ramped up their attacks. The opposition to the treaty was so strongly felt that it even boiled into violence. Just a few weeks after the House bill passed, Muhlenberg would be stabbed by his own brother-in-law, supposedly because of his support for the treaty. So why did Washington sign the Jay Treaty, knowing it was so unpopular? Here is Washington's justification in his own words.
Few, I believe, acquainted with the proceedings in the House of Representatives, conceived that the real question was whether the treaty with Great Britain was a good or a bad one, but whether there should be a treaty at all without the concurrences of that House. On this ground, therefore, it was resolved to attempt at every hazard to render the treaty-making power a nullity without their consent, such as could not fail to reflect disgrace upon the understanding and wisdom of those who framed, but on those also who adopted the Constitution, the inconsistency of giving a power to the President and Senate to make treaties.
Although Washington had strong feelings about the ways in which he was treated by the press, he did not publicly defend his actions. While Washington would occasionally circulate speeches to the nation in newspapers, he may have thought it out of line to respond to the attacks directly.
Anyone who's done any work on Washington will tell you this. Washington was keenly aware of cultivating a particular kind of public image and was mostly convinced of his own virtue in acting in the public interest. And so he did not take criticism lightly at all. There are then other Federalist newspapers in the 1790s, but that is not a place where the Federalists are focused. They are in government and so focused on running the government. And the press is really good at being oppositional, at checking power, at serving as a bulwark of liberty, to use the phrase that a lot of people in the 1780s, 1790s used. And that phrase shows up in a lot of the state constitutions, that freedom of the press is important as a bulwark of liberty. It's a defense against tyranny. Washington and his administration and the Federalists thought they were doing the public work, and so critique of them was actually undermining government, not preventing tyranny. So it really takes a long time for Federalists to get their act together, to be blunt, in terms of engaging in a public policy debate through newspapers.
Thus, most of Washington's reactions to the press are found not in the newspapers, but in private letters and papers to family, friends, and advisors. Some are found in even more private places. In 1797, James Monroe published A View of the Conduct of the Executive in the Foreign Affairs of the United States, a direct attack on Washington's decisions regarding the Genet Affair, Jay Treaty, and French Republic. Who was Monroe's publisher? None other than Benjamin Franklin Bache himself. Monroe delivered one of the most scathing attacks on Washington's presidency, and Washington was not pleased. Unlike other men of the era, Washington did not often write in the margins of his books, but he made a special exception for Monroe's book. In the margins, Washington scribbled a defense of his actions. It is one of the most passionate writings that survive from Washington, and it gives us insight into Washington's thought process during the decisions leading up to the treaty. For example, when Monroe wrote, "In the month of May, 1794, I was invited by the President of the United States, through the Secretary of State, to accept the office of Minister of Plenipotentiary to the French Republic." Washington responded,
After several attempts had failed to obtain a more eligible character,
and when Monroe said that, Mr. John Jay was nominated to Great Britain, which nomination, too, I oppose, because I was of the opinion in the then state of European affairs, it would be made by the enemies of the two republics the means of embroiling us with France, the other party to the European war, and because I thought it was unconstitutional to appoint a member of the judiciary into an executive office. Washington wrote,
did the then situation of our affairs admit of any other alternative than negotiation or war? Was there an abler man to be found to conduct the former, or one more esteemed?
And when Monroe criticized the decision to keep the treaty secret, to express sentiments in private, which it was wished should not become public, appeared to me a strange doctrine to be avowed by the administration of a free people, especially as it was known that the sentiments thus expressed were in harmony with those of the people, and with those publicly and formally expressed by the representatives of the people. Washington defended the decision.
The great and primary object of the administration was to preserve the U.S. in peace by pursuing a conduct strictly neutral. It was not essential then, knowing beforehand with what éclat the reception was to be, to make a parade of sentiments, however strong, might be felt and however pleasing to one nation, which might create unpleasant feelings in other nations with whom we were also at peace and wished to remain so.
Despite its overwhelming unpopularity, the Jay Treaty did successfully keep the United States out of the war between Britain and France. Tensions did not abate entirely. The British practice of impressing American sailors into their navy would eventually contribute to the outbreak of the War of 1812. But the Jay Treaty had some surprisingly long-lasting benefits as well. For example, to this day, members of a native nation in Canada or the United States can pass the border freely thanks to the Jay Treaty. Washington's decision to keep the press at arm's length also likely helped him maintain his reputation. The Jay Treaty was widely disliked, and Washington was no longer immune to criticism. At the same time, his public composure was important in maintaining his overall popularity.
It didn't really harm Washington's presidency all that much because his stature was still so unparalleled that even with this criticism, he still was super famous and super beloved. And so many people, including Jefferson and Madison, wanted him to serve a third term. He could have been elected to a third term easily, maybe not unanimously, but darn near close. However, what it did to Washington was incredibly painful. He had a very thin skin. He really did not like criticism. He did not take it very well. And this was the first time that he had experienced a sustained amount of criticism from a broad swath of the American people. And he hated it. It infuriated him because he knew it was intentional.
Bache would continue his pointed editorials on Washington until Washington left office in 1797. He would then continue to criticize President John Adams. Bache's commentary was so inflammatory that he would be eventually charged under the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. He died of yellow fever before ever making it to trial. That year, his rival, John Fenno, died of the same disease. The Jay Treaty signaled an important moment for Washington's presidency. He had survived the court of popular opinion. The Jay Treaty was an unpopular decision, but a necessary one. It sustained peace with Great Britain for at least another 15 years. American neutrality would become one of the defining policies of Washington's administration. As Washington would write in 1798,
"Peace with all the world is my sincere wish. I am sure it is our true policy, and am persuaded it is the ardent desire of the government."
Next time on Inventing the Presidency, one woman dares to defy the president. When the enslaved maid, Ona Judge, left the presidential mansion, a national manhunt is launched that forces Washington to confront, once again, the question of slavery in the United States.
Washington is very rigorous in pursuing her. He hires agents to find her. He has a flurry of letter writing campaigns. He takes out an ad. She very specifically called out the fact that they did not allow her to learn to read. She's very clear about that. That's among, her legitimate complaints against these people, is that they withheld education.
Inventing the Presidency is a production of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and CD Squared Productions. This episode was written and directed by Dr. Ann Fertig. Audio production was done by Kurt Dahl of CD Squared Production. Production assistant was Jacob Cameron. Narration by Tom Plott. Additional voice acting by Dan Shippey, Matt Mattingly, and James Ambusky. Additional fact-checking was performed by Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. We would like to thank our contributing scholars, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and Dr. Joseph Edelman. To hear more great podcasts from Mount Vernon and the George Washington Presidential Library, visit georgewashingtonpodcast.com or go to www.mountvernon.org. In spring 1793, a merchant ship called the Little Sarah sailed into Philadelphia on what should have been a routine trip. There, it filled its decks with corn and flour before taking off back towards Kingstown, Jamaica, where its cargo would be sold. But the brig would not get far. Shortly after leaving Philadelphia, in the Cape of Delaware, a French ship named the Embuscade sidled up beside it and demanded to board. The Embuscade knew something the Little Sarah didn't. Less than 2 months before, France had declared war on Great Britain. The Little Sarah flew under a British flag. That meant it was a prime target for French privateers, who would seize the ship, sell off its cargo, and repurpose the merchant vessel into a ship of war. The French overtook the British ship and towed the Little Sarah back into Philadelphia. Its British flag was flipped upside down. Crowds cheered the arrival of the captured prize. Its crew replaced the corn and flour with 14 cannons. The Little Sarah was now a privateer. Soon, it would sail out from Philadelphia with an American crew to hunt down other British ships. The Little Sarah was just the last in a series of victories on the sea against the British, all led by the French minister known as Citizen Genet. Young, energetic, and charismatic, Genet was a phenomenon in the States. He recruited American fighters to invade Spanish Florida and used American ports to launch attacks on British ships. The Little Sarah may have been Genet's latest victory, but for Washington, it was the last straw. The brash Frenchman threatened to drag the United States into a European war. Refused the French, and Washington risked a revolution of his own. Defy the British, and the American experiment would be over before it had a chance to begin. Americans were split. Thomas Jefferson called for Washington to honor the Treaty of Alliance between France and the United States. Alexander Hamilton feared what a British embargo could do to American trade and began to consolidate Federalist support for the dissolution of the treaty. Here, caught between two cabinet members, two mighty countries, and his own nation divided, President George Washington faced a critical decision.
Shall a proclamation issue for the purpose of preventing interferences of the citizens of the United States in the war between France and Great Britain? Shall it contain a declaration of neutrality or not? What shall it contain?
This is Inventing the Presidency, Episode 5, The Neutrality Crisis. In 1789, the same year that Washington became president, France underwent a radical shift of its own. The outbreak of the French Revolution forced King Louis XVI to submit to a constitutional monarchy. Early on, the French Revolution enjoyed wide support from Americans. One of the most prominent French allies during the American Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette, took a prominent role in the French Revolution as well. After the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, Lafayette presented the key to the Bastille to Washington. That key is still on display at Mount Vernon today and has become a powerful symbol of the historic friendship between the United States and France. But the constitutional monarchy would not last. In 1792, the king would be deposed and France became a republic. The rise of Republican France, however, did not mean the end of the French Revolution. The French had been the United States' most important ally during the Revolution, and many Americans cheered on the French attempt to launch their own revolution. Other European nations reacted with alarm. They feared that the revolution would spill out into their borders. Austria and Prussia declared war against revolutionary France. In 1793, the revolution took a turn.
March 18th, 1793. The Diary or Loudon's Register. By this day's mail. Death of Louis XVI. The post brought this day a certainty of the execution of the King of France on the 21st January last, between 10 and 11 o'clock of the day. As soon as the execution was effected, 3 huzzas were given by the spectators, hats thrown the air, and, it is said, the executioners and many near the scaffold dipped their buttons in the king's blood as marks of victory and triumph.
Some Americans celebrated the death of the French king, the death of a tyrant as they saw it. Others were horrified by the act. The Americans had overthrown their king, to be sure, but they had not publicly executed him and shown his severed head to the crowds. Many were scandalized by the continued imprisonment and eventual execution of his queen, Marie Antoinette, out of the belief that she, as a woman and a mother, ought to have been spared. 10 days after the death of Louis XVI, France declared war on Britain, the Netherlands, and Spain. By the time news reached the United States, nearly all of Europe was embroiled in war. The United States may have been an ocean away from the trouble, but it quickly found itself entwined within the war in Europe. Here is Sandra Moats, author of Navigating Neutrality.
January, February 1793, the United States gets word that France and Britain are at war once again. They had a series of these imperial wars, and this is just the latest round. Of course, we're in a very different position now. We're no longer colonies. We're no longer part of the British Empire. We've just won our American Revolution with France's help. We also still have very strong ties to Britain, culturally, economically, all of that. So both of these countries see the United States as potentially an ally for either side. France saying, hey, we helped with your war, why don't you help with ours? Britain saying, hey, you colonists, we still have strong ties. Washington very smartly realizes this would be a disaster for us to get involved in this. One, it's an imperial war, it's a continental war, it's imperialistic, it has absolutely nothing to do with the United States. And secondly, we would just be pawns. He even says that the cost to us would be great and the benefits, the results would be terrible. And especially given that we're only 4 or 5 years into the new Constitution, this would just be a disastrous mistake. So the idea is to tamper expectations and to also warn American citizens, stay out of this thing.
At this point in time, Washington was struggling to maintain control in both the Northwest Territories and Western Pennsylvania. The small U.S. Army was occupied in the Northwest War at this time, and there was no U.S. Navy. To fall into an international transatlantic war could topple the young nation, especially against the might of the British Navy, which was at that point the strongest in the world. Here is Lindsay Chervinsky, presidential historian and author of The Cabinet.
When France declared war on Great Britain in February of 1793, Washington immediately, as soon as he heard the news in April, he knew that the nation had no business getting into this war. The country was just really beginning to recover from the revolution, economically, environmentally, physically, mentally, financially, and it had no business getting in a war that was going to wreck all of those things. Even if it had wanted to fight, the nation had no army or navy, so it had nothing to fight with. So this was really not a complicated answer. However, what neutrality looked like was actually a much more complex problem for a couple of reasons. First, in 1778, when the United States had signed a treaty of amity and commerce and a treaty of defense with France, the defense treaty obligated both sides to come to each other's aid if they were attacked. So if France was attacked, in theory, by Great Britain, the United States would need to come to France's aid. So the question here was, well, was France attacked if France was the one that declared war? That was one question that sort of complicated matters and whether it obligated the United States to come to France's aid. The second question is, what is neutral behavior? And this particularly is important around American ports at a time when commerce and trade is mostly taking place on the high seas. People are often bringing their ships in and out of American ports and Caribbean ports and French ports and British ports. And sometimes it's clear that they have no role in the war. Maybe they're just trading food and clothing. But other times it's not as clear. Are they trading arms? Are they trading ammunitions? Are they trading things like wood that can be used to repair ships that are used to fight naval battles? There are a lot of things that are fuzzy, a lot of details that are complicated. And that was really Washington's concern, is how do we define what neutrality is? And then how do we enforce it? Because that also had never been done. It was untested. It was unclear what laws were in play, what courts would hear that decision, who would enforce a punishment. These were all decisions and questions that had to be answered, and it was kind of up to Washington to do so.
For a brief period, the distance of the ocean afforded Washington some time to plan. But his respite would be quickly cut short. Not long after news broke about the execution, on April 8th, 1793, a charismatic French emissary arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was Edmund Charles Genet. He was young and idealistic. His first diplomatic post had been to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia, but his revolutionary zeal proved too controversial, and he was eventually deported. But the government saw great promise in the idealistic, charismatic Genet, who could speak English fluently. Here is one description of Genet, written by John Steele to Alexander Hamilton.
You have heard much of this citizen, no doubt, and therefore anything of him from me will seem superfluous. But as I am writing of the man that we are all afraid of, permit me to say that he has a good person, fine ruddy complexion, is quite active, and seems always in a bustle, more like a busy man than a man of business. His system is, I think, to laugh us into the war, if he can.
As minister of the new government of France, Genet was supposed to present himself directly to President Washington. But instead of going directly to Philadelphia, he took the scenic route through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. All along the way, he was actively recruiting Americans to join the war on the side of France. Genet's instructions from France were, to put it modestly, ambitious. The French wanted an advance of nearly $3 million on the American debt to France from the war. They called for a grandiose new national pact between the United States and revolutionary France, which would pave the way for the spread of republicanism to Spanish Louisiana and British Canada, and give American and French merchants equal footing. They also authorized Genet, with or without American permission, to use the United States as a base to commission privateers in the ongoing war against Great Britain and its allies. But Genet made some crucial missteps. Within days of his arrival in South Carolina, Genet had already commissioned 4 American privateers. Sandra Motes explains the use of privateers in this period.
Everyone thinks piracy is the big thing in this age. It's not. Privateering is, because it's licensed piracy. It's you've been given a commission by a government to attack enemy ships on behalf of that government. So what you do is the state, whether it's the King of Britain or the Queen of Scotland or whatever, has commissions that they give, and they're known as letters of marque. And basically what that does is it gives you, as a ship captain, a license to privateer on behalf of the British government, the American government, whoever has authorized that commission. And it lays out the terms. You outfit your ship, you are acting basically as on behalf of the British Navy or the French Navy, and anything you collect, you basically split the share. The British government, the French government gets a share, and then you get to collect a share. And then you take you literally go and jump on someone else's ship, capture the ship, take that ship and its belongings into port, and then basically cash out. And then the British government, if you're working for them, they'll take their cut, and then you as the ship captain get your cut, and then you give whatever's left to your crew. And as you can see, the more ships you capture as a privateer, the more lucrative it is. It's actually an industry to take regular merchant ships and turn them into warships. So put turrets on them, put cannon. A regular merchant ship only requires about 7 or 10 guys to run. A privateer requires about 100 men, because you got to keep the ship moving, you got to keep it afloat, and you've got to keep the war part going.
The use of American ships to capture British ones could potentially convince the British that the Americans had joined the conflict on the French side. If that happened, not only would trade with Britain cease, but the British would have cause to seize American vessels, and that could mean huge economic losses. But support for the French Revolution was high in the United States. Everywhere he went, Genet was cheered on by crowds of American supporters. Recall how Washington blamed the Democratic Republican societies for riling up support for the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, these same societies hosted grand receptions for Genet as well. Washington even blamed Genet for the formation of such societies.
These things were evidently intended to disquiet the public mind. But I hope and trust they will work their own cure, especially when it is known more generally than it is that the democratic society of this place were instituted by Mr. Genet for the express purpose of dissension, and to draw a line between the people and the government, after he found the officers of the latter would not yield to the hostile measures in which he wanted to embroil this country.
Genet's popularity and the rising support for the French Revolution worried Washington. He quickly assembled his cabinet to debate their options on an official position of neutrality in the European war. Once again, Hamilton and Jefferson found themselves at odds. Hamilton wanted to protect American commercial interests by adhering to a policy of neutrality. Jefferson, on the other hand, believed that such a policy was a violation of previous treaties between the United States and France, in which the United States promised to come to the aid of France in the war. While he was not eager to launch the United States into a war, he did not think the executive had the right to forbid citizens from supporting the French Revolution. It was up to Washington to mediate between these two strong personalities.
Washington, I think, is just his tremendous political skills. Not only is he a big idea person, I think that's something we forget about, he's also a really skilled political negotiator. And what he realizes is this proclamation is not going to be successful unless he has the full backing of his cabinet. And of course, the cabinet consists of the famous rivals, Hamilton and Jefferson, who are the two leading members, and then Henry Knox, who's Secretary of War, and then Edmund Randolph. And before they even sit down to start having their meetings, Washington writes to both Hamilton and Jefferson, basically saying to each of them, I expect you guys to both be constructive and productive in these meetings. We need to work together and all of that. So he gives them a warning at the outset. And then what he very smartly does is he lays out the parameters of, we want to be neutral, we don't want to get involved in this war, let's draft a document, all of you guys give me your thoughts on the matter. And so these guys are like over-eager graduate students. You know, Hamilton writes like a 20-page report, Jefferson's like 15, Randolph's like 10 pages. But this is really smart because what Washington does is every idea you've ever had about neutrality, I want to hear about it, get it out on the table, and we'll come up with a compromise document on neutrality. And so that's how they go about doing it, which is really, really smart. Jefferson doesn't want the word neutrality in the Neutrality Proclamation. So it's actually just called the Proclamation of 1793.
The cabinet arrived at a consensus. Washington would announce a policy of neutrality in the European war, but that Washington would receive Genet as a minister of France. On April 22, 1793, the proclamation was issued.
The duty and interests of the United States require that they should with sincerity and good faith adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial towards the belligerent powers. I have therefore thought fit by these presents to declare the disposition of the United States to observe the conduct aforesaid towards those powers respectively, and to exhort and warn the citizens of the United States carefully to avoid all acts and proceedings whatsoever which may in any manner tend to contravene such disposition.
Neutrality means that during wartime, we don't get involved in a war, in this case between Britain and France, even though we have connections to both of them. And then instead, we say we'll remain friendly with both of you, we'll have free trade with both of you, we'll be friendly, but our ships are not going to be participating, our citizens, our government's not going to formally ally. We're not going to give you any material support or political support for your war. We're going to be friendly, and we hope you respect our ships on the seas and that they enjoy free trade. This comes out of a larger concept, which I won't get too far in the weeds here, but the idea that free ships make for free goods. So if an American ship is a neutral ship, it shouldn't be fair game to be attacked. Whereas if France and Britain are at war, they're going to be attacking each other's ships, whether they're cargo or military ships. So the whole idea behind neutrality is to allow America to stay in business while France and Britain are at war without us getting politically entangled in the war. It's not passivity. It's not isolationism. It means we stay neutral in wartime. We're friendly with everyone.
Genet finally arrived in Philadelphia just a few weeks later. In some respects, his mission had just taken a catastrophic turn. Despite his success in charming Americans, the Washington administration nipped his recruitment efforts before he even had a chance to meet formally with the president. But Genet was not yet done in the United States. On May 17, 1793, his arrival in the city was celebrated by a crowd of supporters outside his hotel. There was some debate about how large the crowd was. Hamilton said 600 people. Jefferson said 1,000. Genet would later recall 6,000 supporters in the streets. And Adams, with some exaggeration, would claim in 1813 that
You certainly never felt the terrorism excited by Genet in 1793, when 10,000 people in the streets of Philadelphia, day after day, threatened to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in the government, or compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution and against England.
the crowds never likely grew above 1,000. But regardless, Adams' account reveals the anxieties stirred up by Genet's powerful rhetoric. The Neutrality Proclamation had failed to stifle support for the French Revolution. But Genet had grown bold. Genet believed that Washington was being led astray by the Federalist anti-French members of his cabinet, specifically Hamilton. Genet wrote letter after letter to Jefferson in French, claiming that treaties between France and the United States entitled him to commission privateers in American ports. Jefferson was initially sympathetic to Genet, but over time, he grew frustrated with Genet's refusal to comply with his directions. He warned him to stay put for the time being and forbid him from continuing to use American ports to outfit new privateers. Here is Lindsay Chervinsky again.
Initially, Jefferson had been very supportive of Genet. He had wanted to give Genet the benefit of the doubt. He had warned Genet repeatedly about the Neutrality Proclamation and asked him to stop with privateers and asked him to cease that behavior. Hamilton was very distrustful of the situation. He was quick to want to request Genet's recall from France, and they battled over these issues constantly in cabinet meetings.
In November